Oh, hi, everybody. My name is Matt Storrs, and welcome to Mattsplaining. On today's episode, I have somebody on who is an expert in one of my all-time favorite shows. Expert, please introduce yourself and tell us what you're an expert in.
Hi, my name is Mandy, and I am an expert in the hit TV show Frasier.
Absolutely wonderful. I love Frasier. I started watching Frasier when I was in my teens, but definitely got into it once I was in college and especially when streaming services were available. It's a great show just to have on in the background. You can kind of like pick up a
hmm
little bit here and there and be really, really just brought into an episode so well. But in my time doing research about the show and watching the show, I've understood it had started out as a spin-off of the show Cheers,
hmm
but and which I've seen some episodes but wasn't as taken. But it wasn't the only spin-off of Cheers that was planned. They actually had one for Norm, the character Norm. It was called Norm and Norman. Basically, what was going to happen is Norm was going to move to Oklahoma and start a house painting business throughout the Midwest. So it would his home base would be in Oklahoma, in Norman, Oklahoma, but he would kind of like go out in a spiral and like kind of a road trip show, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And ultimately, though, the thing that made it so the show didn't get picked up is they felt like, oh, if we remove Norm from Cheers is not going to be the same. So
Yeah,
weren't
that
able.
makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's not the same without Norm. And then also one of the subplots was that the house painting business was a money laundering scheme. And Norm had a history of being an accountant, I believe. And so that was going to be a big, big problem for them. They didn't really want to facilitate discussions of crime.
Yeah.
Um,
Like, can you imagine Norm going into a house to like paint something and the house guests are just like, Norm, like, like they don't
Exactly.
know him?
That literally was one of their main plans. Is Norm was going to be so well known as a house painter that he was going to be known every house that went into. It would be a delight. So Frasier has a brother. His name is Niles. He has a father, Martin Crane, who had been shot in the hip. He was a police officer. He was in the army or the military of some sort. But Niles and Frasier are both therapists, with Frasier being on the radio. Frasier is a Freudian therapist, so it's all based on Freud's theory, whereas Niles is more a Jungian therapist, but he's presented as more persnippety, maybe, a little bit more OCD.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as the show progresses, despite their idiosyncrasies, Niles is clearly the better therapist. And I don't think you may have heard this, but it's a pretty common description in most shows with therapists that how would Niles Crane approach the situation? So, for instance,
Yeah.
on The Sopranos, how would Niles have helped Tony Soprano? And I firmly believe that Niles would have helped Tony get over his issues much more. It would have been definitely a little bit more of a chaotic show, a little bit more slapstick. I think Niles's anxiety would have facilitated a little bit more of danger on his side than Dr. Melfi in that show.
I'm unfamiliar. I haven't watched a lot of The Sopranos, but I would imagine that Niles would probably be freaking out at a lot of the hijinks. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't really do too well with the prospect of danger. But ultimately, I think one of the biggest aspects of the show is that they're mean to Daphne for no particularly good reason, and I think that's a bad thing. And especially as the show progresses. And one of the things is it depicts an aspect of American life and lives of people in general that I think a lot of people overlook is when a parent moves back into the home with a child and there's a caretaking dynamic that is going on. And how can those things that you think like, oh, maybe this will just be a short period of time, there'll be physical therapy and they'll be back on their feet, but how these things kind of extend over time. But ultimately, I think it's a show about codependence
Hmm.
and about how even therapists, how these people that on paper presumably would have their lives together are completely dependent upon all the other people that are in their lives to try and care for themselves and everybody around them without actively doing as much work as you would think that they would do as therapists to improve. You would think that Fraiser eventually would get some better improved skills at communicating with his romantic partners, but only in very special moments does he really get those. Based on what you've heard so far, about how much of that would you say was accurate?
I would say probably 75% of that is accurate. I mean,
Okay.
I have no knowledge of the Norm spinoff whatsoever. Yeah, most of that information was correct. Frasier and Niles are brothers. They are psychiatrists. I
Okay.
mean, therapists, psychiatrists, it's all in the realm of mental health. But yeah, they are psychiatrists. And while Frasier is like kind of nonchalantly rude to Daphne on occasion, Niles is infatuated with her. So
Yes,
he
yes.
he kind of like goes out of his way to make it known that like he adores her without being kind of like without saying it. Like it's kind of a theme throughout the whole show that it's that will they, won't they, like will he ever tell her, will she ever pick up on it? And I mean the show was on for 11 seasons and spoiler alert, it finally happens, but it does take a long time for that to build up.
Right, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that's an aspect of it that I often overlook because it seems like it takes so long for them to get there that it's like a little bit more time with them actually having been a couple would have been a lot of fun to see.
I agree. Yeah. Like when they do finally get together, in my opinion, that season is like one of the worst written seasons. I think because like, okay, now what do we do? Like now that we finally put them together, we have to create this plot line.
Hmm.
And there's also a development in Jane Leeves, the actress who plays Daphne during that season. She's pregnant. And so it's like,
Right.
how do we write this pregnancy when Niles and Daphne finally get together? That's we can't just throw that in. So there was a lot of weird that were made to kind of go around Jane Leeves' absence. So in my opinion, that season is the most cringy to watch.
Yeah,
But I think after then it does kind of pick up that like, okay, they're a couple and like they work well together. But it was a bit of an awkward stage for a bit.
absolutely. When did you first start watching Frasier?
I started watching Frasier in the spring of 2017. And the
Okay.
reason why I started is because around that time I had made the decision to move from Phoenix to Seattle.
Hmm.
And so many of my friends who had already lived in Seattle had said, like, oh, have you seen the show Frasier? And I was like, no, I've heard of it. Like, I know it takes place in Seattle. And they had said, like, well, if you're going to live here, you have to know the show. Like, you have to know all about Frasier. I binge watched the entire series, again, 11 seasons. I binge watched it in 3 months and the 3 months leading up to my move to Seattle. So I
Oh,
came into the
wow.
city like fully like soaked in all of the Frasier knowledge that I could, like ready to go.
That's amazing. And what were your main takeaways when you watched it? Did it make you feel that you were more prepared for the move or to be in Seattle itself?
Yeah, well, when I watched it, like I had at that point told my friends I'm making this move. And around that time, my friends kind of also transitioned without me. They would stop inviting me out to places or they would just kind of get used to not having me around.
Hmm.
So I was in this show while packing boxes and like getting ready for my transition. And I found that I was relying on the show kind of in the way that Frasier's audience, because he's a radio psychiatrist, rely on him for advice or companionship.
I see.
It's a weird way that like I was kind of using Frasier as my psychiatrist, even though like he's a fictional character.
Right.
and in the way that they talk about mental health advocacy, I mean, as you said, like Frasier and Niles, they can dish the advice, they don't always take it.
Right.
So seeing that was also like really comforting to know that like okay, like not everyone is perfect. Like even the therapists or the psychiatrists that like I rely on for help, like they also have their own issues. So that's really comforting to know as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some of the therapists that I've known and been lucky enough to meet have articulated to me about how messed up their community is and how this is kind of actually a very good depiction of the zaniness, basically the ability to compartmentalize and help people, but then going home and having just chaos and disorder. have you found that since you've been in Seattle, you've returned back to Frasier? Has it kind of developed or changed how you've approached the show?
I have found like I've rewatched it a few times now, and I start to notice like whenever they name a neighborhood or a street or whatever, like I try to picture exactly where that is in
Okay.
Seattle, because the show, even though there's 11 seasons of the show, only one episode was filmed in Seattle. Every other episode was filmed on a soundstage in LA. And I think it's the same set that they used for Cheers.
Okay.
But yeah, the only episode that was ever filmed in Seattle was season 5, episode 5, which is the 100th episode. And it's talking about Frasier's 1000th radio broadcast. And
Yeah.
so
Fraiser Crane Day. Yeah.
yes, Frasier Crane Day, exactly. So that was they filmed it at the market, at the Space Needle. There's like a corner where they are gonna go take the monorail, and like every time I drive back past that corner, I like think of Kelsey Grammer and David Hyde Pierce like filming to go on the monorail. And do you know like the date of Frasier Crane Day and all about that kind of
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah. So I know that it is September 11th, and it is, in my opinion, it is definitely one of my favorite episodes, if not my favorite episode, because just how that episode ends. He has gone through this amazing journey to try and get to his special day, and then he is in a cab, I believe it is, and the person's wanting help, and so he's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to help you.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that's a great encapsulation of where his priorities are at the end
Mhm.
of the day.
Exactly. I watch that episode every year on September 11th as I celebrate Frasier Crane Day.
Right.
And what's another interesting thing about like as I mentioned, when they say a street name or a neighborhood, there was always this theory that because the view from Frasier's apartment is not a realistic view, like
Mhm.
anywhere in Seattle, you can't get that view. Um, the closest place you can get to that view, though, is this area in the neighborhood Queen Anne. It's across from this park called Cary Park, which
Okay.
is the most beautiful view. You get the skyline, you get the water. On a good day, you can see Mount Rainier. So it's theorized that Frasier lives near the Cary Park area.
Oh,
So every time I go to Cary Park, I think that like, oh, I'm gonna go visit my bud Frasier. But there
oh,
was
that's
one
great.
episode, I can't remember exactly which episode it is. I just remember that Frasier's car is in it's like broken down, it's in the shop. So he and Roz, his assistant, are taking the bus. And he obviously Frasier's not used to the bus system. So when he gets on the bus, he tells the driver, "Can you stop at 3rd and Highland?" And Roz is telling him, "Oh no, he's just gonna stop when he makes a stop." And I looked at exactly where 3rd and Highland is, and it's like 3 blocks from Cary Park.
Oh,
So it
wow.
adds up that he would be living in that area.
I love that you did that. You got that deduction to figure that out. That is wild. I love that.
I was like, I need to know. I need to confirm this theory.
Oh yeah, I want to know if I go to this park, will will I run into Eddie getting walked one day?
Exactly.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. And so, do you feel that you approach Frasier as something that you just like have a besides the Frasier Crane Day episode? Are there other episodes that you often go back to?
Yeah, I am a big fan of season 2. I think the writing, obviously, for most shows in their first season, they're just kind of figuring it out. They're figuring out these characters. And season 2 has a lot of my favorite episodes, just strictly based on miscommunication, which is a big theme
Right,
in the show. Like episode 3 of season 2 is the matchmaker,
right.
which Frasier's got this new boss and he's trying to set his boss up with Daphne, but the boss is gay. So when Frasier invites him over, the boss thinks he's on a date with Frasier. There's a whole kind of misunderstanding with that. Another episode in that season that kind of ties into miscommunication is, I think it's episode 21 or 22. It's An Affair to Forget,
Hmm.
where Niles's wife at the time, Maris, has a fencing instructor who is infatuated with her. So Niles thinks he's gonna go like fight this fencing instructor, but the instructor only speaks German.
Hmm.
And so they have to use Niles's maid, who speaks Spanish and German, and then Fraiser, who speaks English and Spanish. There's like a four-way translation system
Beautiful.
for like Niles to express his anger and the fencing instructor to express his infatuation, but obviously lost in translation there.
Right.
Yeah, so I would say, see, if anyone is listening and they're going to start somewhere, I say start with the early episodes of season 1 just to kind of figure out who these characters are. But season 2 is just one golden episode after another.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And
Mhm.
I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me about this today. I had a lot of fun. Uh,
Yay! I
yeah.
don't get to talk Frasier with a lot of people. I mean,
Hmm.
especially living in Seattle, everyone's kind of over it at this point. So
Right.
I am always happy to talk Frasier with anyone who's listening, as Frasier would
Absolutely.
say.
Absolutely. If people wanted to learn more about you or learn more about Frasier, where would you recommend they go?
So for people who want to learn more about Frasier, I know that it is streaming on Hulu,
Okay.
and I think it might be streaming on Paramount Plus because I know that that is where the reboot will be
Okay.
streaming. So I highly suggest, taking a watch at them. And if people want to learn more about me, I am online on any socials at Mixtape Mandy, and that's Mandy with an I. Or if you want to follow my music, because I'm a musician, I'm Lane Lines. So I'm at Lane Lines Music on any socials, or you can listen to my music on Spotify, Apple, Bandcamp, any of those under the name Lane Lines.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My name is Matt Storrs, and this has been Mattsplaining.